Welcome to Whitman and Place, a guide to Walt Whitman's New York. In this video, I will be introducing you to what we now know as two different boroughs of New York City as Whitman would have known them, as places most dear to his heart and to his poetic project. With help from the Walt Whitman Archive, we will take a look at the effects of living in Brooklyn and Manhattan on his poetry. You can find the archive here at www.whitmanarchive.org. Also, notice that each slide has a number. At the end of the video, you can find credit information for each image using this number. The Whitman Archive is a free-to-use online collection of resources relevant to Whitman and Whitman studies. Here, you can find every edition of Leaves of Grass, as well as his other writings, manuscripts, information about Whitman's life, literary criticism, and even images of Whitman. Let's start by looking at Whitman's life by clicking at the biography link here. If you're following along on your own, you should see a page that looks something like this. If you scroll down, you'll find links to jump to various sections of the biography. Today, we'll be focusing on the period covered by these sections here. I encourage you to pause the video and read these sections if you are interested in learning more about the years that Whitman spent here. Otherwise, let's jump right in. Walt Whitman is the founding father of American free verse poetry and is thought by many to be America's most important poet. He is usually recognizable by his ever-present bushy beard, but in the years we're considering, he looked more like this. In this video, we will get to know this younger, more impressionable Whitman by exploring the places that were significant to him. Anyone who is familiar with Whitman's connection to Brooklyn probably knows his poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, first published in the 1856 edition of Leaves as Sundown Poem, with its lines like, "Who knows but I am as good as looking at you now, for all you cannot see me." Here are the beginnings of both the first and last edition of the poem side by side for comparison. Notice the changes in wording at the beginning of the poem, here and here, and the stanza changes throughout, which shows us how thoroughly Whitman edited Leaves from edition to edition. Whitman was familiar with the ferry, and with Brooklyn and Manhattan in general, because of his long walks. Take a look at this map from historicmapworks.com, a site dedicated to preserving and collecting a wide range of historical and geographical maps, charts, and atlases. This is only a partial image of one side of Whitman's stroll, with the total distance there and back covering 8 miles a day, bare minimum, and only if there were no digressions from this route. Whitman was definitely in shape. The length of the walk was partially because the many places Whitman lived in Brooklyn were so far away from his favorite hangouts in Manhattan. One of these Brooklyn homes was a house on Ryerson Street, the house where Whitman first wrote and published Leaves of Grass. Whitman's near-daily journey forth from Ryerson Street or elsewhere in Brooklyn would have taken him straight up Fulton Street, where he may have seen sights similar to the one depicted here. If he had turned back, he could have seen fairly far down the street. Notice the modern picture at the right, which shows us that at this end of the street at least, the view is almost exactly the same as it was in Whitman's day. From there, Whitman also would have been able to see his old workplace at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, one of the many newspaper jobs he held. Whitman had been a journalist from a very young age, and he was the editor of the Eagle for 2 years. If you take a close look next to the arch at the location of the current Eagle warehouse, you'll even see that they have installed a plaque in honor of Whitman's time there. Whitman, the poet of the open road, would probably have loved the visual juxtaposition outside of the Eagle offices of the cobbled road he knew with the paved road we see today. Whitman also bounced around the various newspapers of Printing House Square in Manhattan as well. This gave him a lot of journalistic experience, as well as printing expertise, which would help him when he began publishing Leaves. For now, let's head back to our walk. Turning back around from Whitman's old workplace in Brooklyn, he would have seen the Fulton Ferry landing stretched out before him. While the date on this image, the 1830s, places it slightly before Whitman's time, the late 1840s through the 1860s, it still gives us an idea of what he might have seen. An even better image to show us what Whitman would have seen is this one, from the 1860s. This is a little closer to what he would have experienced, if a little less close to the docks themselves. Today, you can cross the East River by way of the famous Brooklyn Bridge, but in Whitman's day, the only way to get this view was to take, you guessed it, the ferry. These ferry trips were hugely important to Whitman because of the variety of people you could see while taking them, as well as for the view of both of his beloved cities. He would have ridden on a boat like the Olive Branch here, or on a boat like the Union, possibly on these very boats themselves, on the way to, in his words, walk the streets of Manhattan Island. Now, imagine what you would do if you were Walt Whitman among crowds of people and surrounded by city, at least twice a day. Luckily for us, we know what he did. He wrote. Take a look at this simple scrap of paper Whitman scrawled an idea on. This idea to write a list of all that is seen on his journeys would eventually become Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Notice how he starts that list he was talking about there on the right side, while also addressing us, both future readers and future writers of the ferry as well. This wasn't the end of Whitman's journey, though. At the Manhattan side of Fulton, he would disembark from the ferry and explore Manhattan, and one of the first things he would have seen was the chaos of Broadway, a favorite haunt. Most often, he would head to what he called the Vault at Pfaff's, a sort of bohemian underground cafe where artists would meet to talk and share their work. Notice Whitman himself depicted in the image at left. Today, Pfaff's has been replaced by a deli, but in its heyday, it was a bustling center of artistic convention and manly camaraderie, as he would come to call the homosocial and homoerotic bonds formed there, and Whitman loved it. Another of Whitman's favorite places to visit in Manhattan throughout his life was the theater. Any theater, virtually any show, but especially if opera was playing. Whitman adored the opera and attended any chance he got. Theatrical conventions, as well as the music of these operas, had a huge influence on his poetry. Opera and musical terms, singing, and other references to the opera often colored his poetry, and he often used these to describe what he himself was trying to do. Look at this 1860 version of the poem eventually titled I Hear America Singing, in which he describes all Americans as singers, and thus all of America as a song. This sense of music as expression was fairly important to him and probably came from the hours he spent at the opera. As if he hadn't done enough walking already, Whitman often explored Manhattan at his leisure, walking amongst the people and hearing what he called the blab of the pave. This was hugely important to his democratic writing, as it allowed him to mingle with people from all walks of life. He also frequently walked in Battery Park, where he would watch the ships full of immigrants come in. Today, one of Whitman's poems is inscribed along the railings of the very walkway he used to frequent. These experiences of watching the ships made it into several of his poems, including this 1856 to 1860 manuscript, which may have been an early draft of the 1867 poem City of Ships. While the two bear resemblance mostly in the subject, the reverse side of the manuscript does include the title City of Ships on it. Whitman was an expert at taking details from what he saw around him and using them to fuel his poetry, and not only in Brooklyn and Manhattan. Here we have a poem about his birthplace of Long Island, starting from Paumanok, which heavily uses imagery from his early childhood and early manhood here when he was a schoolteacher. The question remains, what's the point of looking at the places Whitman used to go? As we've already seen, these places inspired and touched Whitman deeply. He was indebted to the sights, sounds, and smells of his urban environment. By getting to know these places better, we can get much closer to understanding the meanings and motivations of Whitman's poems. We can also come to appreciate the effects of location on writing a poem. For example, what's different about writing a poem from a ferry rather than from a desk? What gets included that otherwise might not have? What gets edited out when you're talking about your work with a bunch of your bohemian friends at the bar, or walking through a park, rather than when you're looking at your poem at a desk in a room alone? Whitman's exposure to people from all walks of life and the vastly different settings and characteristics of Brooklyn and Manhattan gave him so much material and such variety of material that these very places contributed to his democratic poetic style and values. Whitman wanted his poetry to be able to represent all people of every class, race, creed, description, you name it. And what better way to do that than by recording as many details about as many varieties of people as you can? Next time you're walking down the street, whether you live in Manhattan or any other hometown, take the time to notice the people and places you pass. It might just be the inspiration you need to write one great poem. All of the images you've seen here today were used for educational purposes only and were sourced from the Walt Whitman Archive, the New York Public Library, Historic Mapworks, Whitman's Brooklyn, the Vault at Pfaff's, and private collections of those involved with this project used with permission. To find specific credit information for each image, please refer to the number at the bottom right of each section of the video and the corresponding number here. For more information, please email cwaitina@calpoly.edu. Thank you.